The man at the window. Sofía had never believed in horror stories. To her, tales of ghosts and strange beings were nothing more than stories meant to scare children. However, when she moved into that small apartment on the 5th floor of an old building, she began to realize that some stories can become real. She had gotten a place for an unbelievably low price, which seemed like an incredible stroke of luck. It was in a quiet part of the city, perfect for focusing on her studies. The window in her room overlooked a narrow street, deserted at night, barely lit by a few old streetlights that flickered constantly, giving everything an eerie atmosphere. The first night passed normally. She settled into her new home, unpacked her things, and stayed up late organizing books and clothes. By the time she got into bed, she barely had the strength to keep her eyes open. She slept deeply without interruption. But on the second night, everything changed. It was around 11 when she looked up from her desk and glanced out the window. At first, she didn't notice anything strange. But then, her gaze fixed on a figure standing beneath the nearest streetlight. A tall, thin man, wearing a long dark coat, was standing there. He wasn't walking. He wasn't moving. He didn't seem to be waiting for anyone. He was simply standing still, looking in her direction. Sofía frowned. Maybe it was just a neighbor, or someone who had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. She shrugged and returned to her notes, convinced it was nothing to worry about. However, when she looked again 20 minutes later, the man was still there. His posture was identical, not the slightest change. And then, Sofía had a strange feeling, an irrational but undeniable certainty. That man was watching her. A chill ran down her spine. She looked away and closed the curtain. She tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that it was just a coincidence. Still, she struggled to sleep that night. The next day, when night fell, she promised herself she wouldn't look out the window. She didn't want to obsess over something meaningless. But as the hours passed, anxiety grew in her chest. Finally, when the clock struck midnight, she couldn't resist. She approached slowly and carefully pulled back the curtain. He was still there, the same dark coat, the same motionless posture, his head tilted at the slightest angle, just enough to be looking at her window. But that night, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a small child, around 6 or 7 years old. He was thin, his face pale, and his eyes empty of expression. The child was watching her, too. Sofía felt a lump in her throat. She slowly stepped back, unable to look away. She yanked the curtains shut and tried to breathe calmly. That night, she slept with the lights on. The next night, when she looked again, there were 2 children. The next night, for each day, the group beneath the streetlight grew. Children, elderly people, women, all motionless, all looking at her window. None of them showed any emotion. None of them moved. Sofía stopped opening the curtains. She forced herself to ignore them, to pretend they didn't exist. But their presence was impossible to forget. And then the knocking began. The first time, it happened past 3 in the morning. A slow, hollow sound. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the window. Her heart stopped. She lay completely still in her bed, holding her breath. There couldn't be anyone on the other side of the glass. She was on the 5th floor. But then the sound came again. Knock, knock, knock. Trembling, she gathered what little courage she had and turned her head toward the window. The curtain was closed. The room was silent. She waited a minute, then 2. No sound came again. After a long while, she tried to convince herself she had imagined it, until the next night, when it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. She couldn't keep ignoring it. Almost without realizing what she was doing, she got out of bed and approached the window. She took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, pulled the curtain back. And there he was, the man at the window. But this time, he wasn't on the street. He was right outside the glass. Sofía screamed and fell backward. For a moment that felt eternal. Time seemed frozen. When she looked again, he was gone. The window was still closed. There was no sign that anyone had been there, but she knew she hadn't imagined it. The next night, she decided she couldn't stay. She had to leave. She hastily packed her suitcase, not caring about leaving things behind. She just wanted to get out of there. But just as she grabbed her keys and reached for the door, she heard something. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from her bedroom door. Terror paralyzed her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The doorknob began to turn slowly. And then she felt it behind her. The air turned icy. Her skin prickled with fear. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't respond. A voice echoed in her head. It's your turn. And then everything went dark. The next morning, Sophia's neighbor noticed that the apartment door was slightly open. She called the police. When the officers entered, they found the room untouched. Nothing seemed out of place. Her belongings were still there. The only clue was a window, which had been left open. There was no trace of Sophia. Days later, a new tenant moved into the apartment. Her name was Mariana. That night, as she settled into her new home, she looked out the window and saw someone standing beneath the streetlight. It was a young woman, pale, with empty eyes. Sophia,